You have been calling yourself lost because the life that once gave you direction no longer answers when you ask it who you are. You still perform the necessary movements. You reply to messages. You meet obligations. You make plans that sound reasonable when spoken aloud. Yet beneath those movements, something has gone quiet. The ambitions that once pulled you forward feel strangely weightless. The people around you may still recognize your face, your habits, and your role, but you no longer feel fully present inside the person they recognize. You may believe this means you have failed. You may think you have become indecisive, ungrateful, lazy, or emotionally unstable. You may compare yourself to people who appear certain about what they want and wonder why certainty has become impossible for you. But the deeper problem is not that you have lost your direction. The deeper problem is that you can no longer pretend the old direction belongs to you. Carl Jung spent decades studying this exact psychological threshold. He saw that a person often feels most disoriented when the identity built for adaptation begins to separate from the identity required for individuation. The confusion is not accidental. It appears because the conscious mind has reached the edge of the map it has been using. This is why the experience can feel so frightening. You are not simply choosing between two careers, two relationships, or two versions of the future. You are standing between two organizing principles of the personality. One was built from everything you learned you had to become. The other is emerging from something deeper that has not yet found language. The phrase "old soul" is often used carelessly, as though it describes someone wiser or more spiritually important than other people. Psychologically, it can describe something far less glamorous. It can describe a person who became inwardly observant early, who noticed contradictions others ignored, who learned to read emotional atmospheres before learning to trust personal desire. You may have felt older than your age because you were required to understand too much too soon. You may have learned to sense disappointment before it was expressed. You may have noticed the difference between what people said and what they actually felt. You may have become thoughtful because thought gave you distance from confusion. That sensitivity helped you adapt. It also made ordinary paths difficult to inhabit without question. You can follow expectations for a while. You can build the respectable identity, accept the familiar role, and pursue the goals praised by your environment. Yet eventually, the inner contradiction becomes too strong. Your outer life may continue functioning, while your inner participation quietly disappears. Jung described psychic energy as libido, not merely in the sexual sense, but as the general energy of life, attention, desire, imagination, and meaning. When that energy withdraws from an identity, you cannot restore it through discipline alone. You may force the behavior, but you cannot force genuine investment. This withdrawal is often misread as collapse. A person sits at a desk where work once felt meaningful. The screen is open, the cursor blinking inside an unfinished document. He reaches for his phone, puts it down, and reads the same sentence again. When someone asks how the project is going, he says, "Almost finished," although he has not touched it in 3 days. From the outside, this looks like procrastination. From the inside, it may be the psyche refusing to continue financing a life that has become psychologically false. If you feel lost now, your confusion may be the surface expression of a deeper reorganization. The conscious mind wants a clear replacement before surrendering the familiar structure. The unconscious rarely works in that order. It often removes your emotional attachment to the old path before revealing the shape of the new one. This creates an interval in which nothing seems reliable. The old ambition has weakened. The new desire is incomplete. The old identity feels dishonest. The emerging identity feels too fragile to claim. You are unable to return, but you cannot yet move forward with conviction. Jungian psychology calls this a liminal condition. You are between forms. The personality that carried you this far is losing authority, while the deeper center of the psyche has not yet established a new relationship with consciousness. The danger is not the uncertainty itself. The danger is that you will panic and rebuild the old prison simply because you recognize the furniture. Your loss of motivation is not always a failure of will. Sometimes it is the withdrawal of life energy from a persona that has completed its purpose. The persona is the social face you develop to meet the demands of the world. Jung did not treat the persona as false in itself. You need a functional identity. You need language, roles, responsibilities, and ways of relating to other people. The problem begins when you mistake the role for the whole of who you are. You may have become the dependable one because unreliability surrounded you. You may have become the quiet one because conflict felt dangerous. You may have become accomplished because achievement brought the approval that simple existence did not. You may have become spiritually composed because anger threatened the image others had of you. These identities may have protected you. They may even have created real success. Yet a protection can become a confinement when you are no longer permitted to live outside it. A woman arrives home after another day of solving everyone else's problems. She leaves her keys on the same small table and stands in the hallway without removing her coat. Her phone vibrates with a message asking for another favor. She types, "Of course," stares at the words, then deletes them and closes the door quietly. Nothing dramatic has happened. Yet the pause before answering contains an entire personality beginning to resist its assigned role. What you have been calling exhaustion may be the cost of maintaining a persona that no longer allows your full reality to exist. The psyche does not always announce this resistance through clear thoughts. It may appear as numbness, irritation, forgetfulness, fantasies of disappearing, or a sudden inability to tolerate conversations you once endured politely. You may feel guilty because people have not necessarily changed. Your tolerance has changed because the unconscious is no longer willing to sacrifice the same parts of you. This is why you may feel detached from goals that once defined your future. The goals belonged to a version of you organized around adaptation. They answered the question, "What must you become to belong?" They did not necessarily answer the question, "What life expresses the person you are becoming?" The loss of motivation becomes frightening only when you assume motivation must always return to its previous object. You keep trying to become excited about the old plan. You make new schedules. You consume advice. You tell yourself that consistency will solve the problem. Discipline may restore movement, but it cannot restore meaning where meaning has withdrawn. Jung observed that when conscious life becomes too narrow, the unconscious compensates. It produces dreams, moods, fantasies, symptoms, and attractions that challenge the existing attitude. What seems inconvenient may be the psyche attempting to restore a missing dimension of life. You may suddenly become fascinated by something that does not fit your established identity. You may long for solitude after years of constant availability. You may feel drawn toward creativity after building a life around efficiency. You may want simplicity after chasing recognition. You may begin questioning relationships that depend on your silence. These impulses can look irrational because they do not serve the old structure. Their purpose may be to correct it. A man finishes another meeting in which his promotion is discussed. Everyone congratulates him before the decision is official. He smiles, thanks them, and later sits alone in his parked car. Instead of imagining the new office, he searches for photographs of a small coastal town he visited years earlier, then quickly closes the page when a colleague walks past. His fantasy is not necessarily a literal instruction to abandon everything and move away. It is an image carrying qualities his current life excludes: space, slowness, anonymity, and the right to exist without performing importance. What you have been calling distraction may be the unconscious showing you the emotional qualities your official future refuses to contain. The true path rarely appears first as a complete plan. It appears as a change in what you can no longer tolerate. You may expect your calling to arrive as inspiration. More often, it begins as friction. The conversation becomes unbearable. The role feels too small. The compromise that once seemed practical now feels like betrayal. The environment has not necessarily become worse. Your capacity to abandon yourself inside it has weakened. Jung understood individuation as a movement toward greater psychological wholeness. Wholeness is not achieved by adding only beautiful or admirable qualities. It requires a confrontation with everything excluded from the conscious identity. Your emerging direction may therefore be hidden inside the parts of yourself you were taught to distrust. If you built your identity around being agreeable, your path may require conflict. If you built it around competence, your path may require becoming a beginner. If you built it around independence, your path may require receiving help. If you built it around spiritual calm, your path may require admitting the full force of your anger. The new direction feels wrong because the old personality was constructed to prevent exactly these experiences. A woman listens while her family explains what she should do next. She nods at the familiar moments and says, "That makes sense," because those words have always ended the conversation safely. That evening, she opens a blank page and writes one sentence: "I do not want the life they are describing." She immediately closes the notebook and hides it beneath a stack of clothes. The sentence is not yet a plan. It is more important than a plan because it is the first honest boundary between her inner life and the expectations surrounding it. What you have been calling confusion may be the first stage of honesty, because a false certainty is finally becoming impossible to maintain. The shadow becomes especially active during this period. Jung called the shadow the collection of qualities, impulses, memories, and potentials that the conscious personality refuses to identify as its own. The shadow is not only cruelty, selfishness, or aggression. It also contains courage, vitality, desire, creativity, ambition, tenderness, and instinct when those qualities threaten the accepted identity. You may have spent years describing yourself as someone who does not need much. Perhaps needing less made you easier to love. You may have said you were not ambitious because ambition risked criticism. You may have insisted that recognition did not matter because wanting to be seen exposed you to rejection. The shadow preserves what the persona cannot admit. When the old path begins collapsing, these disowned qualities return. They do not always return gracefully. They may emerge through envy, resentment, emotional outbursts, or obsessive fascination with people who embody what you suppress. You may judge someone for being unapologetic because you have never allowed yourself to take up space. You may resent someone who changes direction freely because your identity depends on staying consistent. You may feel threatened by someone who speaks directly because you have built safety through careful self-editing. These reactions are not proof that you are becoming worse. They reveal where your life energy has been imprisoned. A person scrolls past a photograph of an old acquaintance, announcing a dramatic career change. He feels a sharp irritation and tells himself the decision is irresponsible. He puts the phone down, walks into the kitchen, and begins criticizing the announcement to no one. Beneath the criticism is a sentence he cannot yet bear to say. He gave himself permission before I did. Envy often hurts because it reveals a life you have prohibited yourself from wanting. What you have been calling bitterness may be grief for the unlived parts of you that are demanding recognition. This does not mean every impulse must become action. Individuation is not impulsiveness. It is the development of a conscious relationship with what was previously unconscious. The shadow must be listened to, not obeyed blindly. Your anger may show you where a boundary is missing, but it does not decide how the boundary should be expressed. Your envy may reveal desire, but it does not determine whether the object of envy is truly right for you. Your fantasy may contain symbolic truth, without functioning as literal instruction. The task is to ask what quality the impulse carries. Perhaps you do not need another person's life. You need their willingness to disappoint expectations. Perhaps you do not need to abandon your responsibilities. You need to stop using responsibility as a justification for permanent self-erasure. Perhaps you do not need to destroy your relationships. You need to discover which relationships survive your honesty. Your true path begins appearing when you separate the deeper quality from the surface image. You may think you need a different job, when what you truly need is autonomy. You may think you need a new city, when what you truly need is distance from a role. You may think you need spiritual transcendence, when what you truly need is permission to feel ordinary human anger. Jung's work repeatedly returned to symbols because the unconscious communicates through images before concepts become clear. A dream, fantasy, recurring memory, or unexplained attraction may contain the early shape of a direction that your rational mind cannot yet formulate. You keep waiting for an answer in the form of a sentence. The answer may first arrive as an atmosphere. A man repeatedly dreams of entering a house with one locked room. During the day, he dismisses the dream and continues living according to schedules that leave no unstructured time. One evening, he hears music he loved as a teenager and feels an unexpected pressure behind his eyes. Instead of turning it off, he remains seated until the song ends. The locked room is not a magical prediction. It is the image of a psychological territory excluded from his adult identity, a territory where sensitivity, creativity, and grief have been waiting without language. What you have been calling aimlessness may be the period in which your psyche is teaching you to recognize meaning before you can explain it. Solitude becomes necessary because the emerging self is easily drowned out by collective expectations. This does not mean isolation is inherently wise. Withdrawal can become avoidance when it is used to escape relationship, responsibility, or reality. Yet there are periods when reduced social participation is psychologically necessary because constant exposure to other people's opinions prevents your own inner material from becoming distinct. Jung valued the movement inward because the collective personality can be powerful. Families, communities, workplaces, and cultures supply ready-made answers about success, morality, maturity, and belonging. These answers help organize life. They also become dangerous when they replace personal confrontation. An old soul often feels especially vulnerable to collective pressure because you can understand many perspectives at once. You can see why your parents wanted what they wanted. You can recognize your partner's fear. You can appreciate the logic of the practical choice. Your empathy becomes so comprehensive that your own position disappears. You do not lack an inner voice. You keep translating it into everyone else's language until it no longer sounds like you. A woman sits in a cafe with a friend who asks what she actually wants. She begins answering, then immediately explains why each desire would be inconvenient for someone else. Her coffee cools between her hands. When the friend asks the question again, she looks toward the window and says, "I do not know," although 3 answers have already passed through her mind. Her uncertainty is not empty. It is overcrowded by anticipated reactions. What you have been calling indecision may be the habit of consulting every imagined authority before allowing your own desire to finish a sentence. The true path often requires a period in which you stop explaining yourself too early. Explanation exposes an emerging truth to evaluation before it has developed strength. When you speak too soon, other people respond from the identity they already know. They remind you of your responsibilities, your history, and your established character. Their reactions can pull you back into the persona before the new orientation becomes conscious enough to defend itself. Silence, in this phase, is not necessarily secrecy. It can be psychological incubation. A seed does not need public agreement before it forms roots. You may feel pressure to announce what comes next because uncertainty embarrasses the conscious mind. You want a title, a plan, or a new identity that proves the confusion had a purpose. Yet rushing toward definition may recreate the same problem under a different name. You can escape one persona by manufacturing another. The responsible one becomes the rebellious one. The achiever becomes the spiritual outsider. The person who lived for approval begins living for the approval of people who reject conventional approval. The costume changes, but the dependence remains. Jung warned against identification with archetypal roles because they can inflate the personality. The seeker, healer, outsider, wounded guide, or old soul may become another identity used to avoid ordinary uncertainty. You begin believing your discomfort proves that you are more awakened than the people around you. This is not individuation. It is the ego decorating its confusion with spiritual importance. A man begins speaking about how different he is from everyone in his life. He dismisses old friends as unconscious and interprets every disagreement as evidence of their inability to understand him. Yet when he sits alone without an audience, he feels the same uncertainty he felt before adopting the language of awakening. The new vocabulary has given him status, but not direction. Your sensitivity does not make you superior. It gives you a particular responsibility to distinguish genuine inner guidance from the desire to feel exceptional. What you have been calling spiritual difference may need to become psychological accountability before it can become a path. The self does not appear to flatter the ego. In Jungian psychology, the self represents the totality and organizing center of the psyche, larger than the conscious personality. It does not exist to confirm every preference. Its movement toward wholeness may demand that you release identities you worked hard to build. It may confront you with limitations, contradictions, and obligations you hoped your awakening would remove. Your path may not make you feel special. It may make you more honest. You may need to admit that a dream was partly built from your hunger for recognition. You may need to accept that a relationship is not entirely oppressive, but that you have used its imperfections to avoid responsibility for your choices. You may need to acknowledge that you remained trapped not only because others demanded it, but because the familiar role protected you from risk. This is where the feeling of being lost becomes psychologically useful. It removes the illusion that the conscious ego can engineer transformation without surrendering control. The ego wants to choose a future that preserves every existing attachment. It wants a true path that costs nothing, disappoints no one, risks no failure, and allows the old identity to remain admired. Such a path does not exist. The emerging life will require exclusion. To choose one direction is to release others. To speak truth is to lose certain forms of approval. To become visible is to surrender the protection of hidden potential. To establish a boundary is to discover who benefited from your lack of one. This is why the path remains unclear for so long. Part of you does not want clarity. You say you are waiting to know what you should do. Yet you may already know the first truth. You know which conversation has become unavoidable. You know which commitment is maintained mainly through fear. You know where your body tightens before you agree. You know which dream you repeatedly reduce to something more acceptable. What you do not know is how much the truth will cost. That uncertainty is real. It should not be romanticized. Following a more authentic direction can involve grief, financial instability, loneliness, changed relationships, and the humiliation of starting without mastery. Psychological growth does not exempt you from practical consequences. Jung did not describe individuation as a comfortable journey toward constant peace. It is a differentiation from unconscious collective patterns, followed by a more conscious return to life. You do not leave the world because you are deeper than it. You learn to participate without abandoning the inner center from which your participation becomes meaningful. A woman receives an offer that would secure the future everyone has encouraged her to pursue. She reads the email twice and notices that her breathing becomes shallow. Her hand moves toward the reply button, then stops. In another tab is an unfinished application for a path that offers less certainty and far more personal responsibility. No sign appears to rescue her from choosing. No perfect feeling removes the risk. The decision becomes real precisely because both options have consequences. What you have been calling fear of the wrong path may partly be grief over the fact that no true path allows you to keep every version of yourself alive. The deeper cost is not simply losing security. It is losing innocence about your own participation in the old life. As long as you believe you are only trapped by circumstances, you can remain psychologically passive. You can wait for permission, rescue, certainty, or a dramatic external change. Once you recognize the ways you have collaborated with the persona, you inherit the burden of choice. You may have remained silent because silence protected belonging. You may have stayed available because being needed protected you from confronting emptiness. You may have pursued achievement because success postponed the question of what you actually value. You may have called your fear intuition because fear gave you a respectable reason not to risk failure. This realization can feel harsher than blaming the world. It also returns your agency. You are not responsible for every condition that shaped you. You are responsible for what you continue once you can see it. The true path appears when you become more willing to bear the consequences of truth than the consequences of self-abandonment. Until that point, the psyche may keep you suspended. It may continue withdrawing energy from false directions while refusing to provide a complete replacement. This suspension is not punishment, it is pressure. It forces you to develop a different basis for action. You have been trained to move when you receive approval, certainty, urgency, or visible reward. The emerging path may require movement based on inner congruence, even when external confirmation is absent. This is the birth of psychological authority. Authority does not mean absolute confidence. It means you stop requiring your deepest decisions to feel comfortable before you respect them. You stop treating anxiety as proof that a choice is wrong. You stop expecting every important decision to be accompanied by peace. Sometimes peace comes later, after the nervous system learns that honesty did not destroy you. You are allowed to stop forcing enthusiasm for the life that is losing its claim on you. You are allowed to stop presenting uncertainty as a personal defect. You are allowed to admit that an old ambition has ended without immediately replacing it with a more impressive one. You are allowed to remain quiet while a deeper orientation develops. You do not need to turn confusion into a spiritual identity. You do not need to prove that your suffering makes you wiser. You do not need to reject ordinary responsibilities in order to honor your inner life. You only need to stop lying about where your energy has gone. Some doors have become heavy because you are no longer meant to enter them as the person you were. Some relationships feel strained because you are beginning to arrive without the mask that once maintained harmony. Some goals feel empty because they were built to secure recognition rather than express meaning. This does not tell you exactly what comes next. It tells you why the old instructions no longer work. Jung called the capacity to hold opposing truths the transcendent function. It develops when you resist the urge to resolve tension prematurely. You allow the conscious position and the unconscious demand to remain in relationship until a third possibility emerges, one that could not have been produced by either side alone. You may not need to choose between total conformity and reckless escape. A third path may appear when you remain present long enough to understand the actual conflict. You may not need to abandon your entire life. You may need to inhabit it from a different center. You may not need a dramatic revelation. You may need one honest action that changes the structure of your relationship with yourself. The path appears through participation. It becomes visible as you stop performing certainty and begin responding to what is already true. A boundary reveals the relationship. A refusal reveals the desire. A period of silence reveals which thoughts are actually yours. A small act of creation reveals whether energy returns when it is given a more honest object. You are not required to see the entire road. You are required to stop pretending the road behind you still leads somewhere. The lostness you fear may be the final loyalty of the old identity. It keeps searching for directions using values that no longer organize your life. It keeps asking how to succeed at a role your deeper personality has already begun to release. From the viewpoint of that role, you are lost. From the viewpoint of individuation, you are becoming unavailable for a life built on unconscious obedience. The true path does not always arrive as a sudden vision. It appears quietly, through the return of energy, the deepening of honesty, and the growing inability to betray what you now recognize. You may notice that one conversation leaves you more present. One form of work restores concentration. One boundary produces grief, but also relief. Follow the return of inner participation, not the promise of permanent comfort. You have not reached the end of direction. You have reached the end of borrowed direction. What feels like emptiness is the space left behind when the persona can no longer occupy the center of your life. What feels like delay is the psyche refusing to replace one false certainty with another. What feels like being lost may be the first time you are no longer moving according to a map drawn entirely by fear, duty, or approval. Your true path appears when you stop demanding that it resemble the path you were trained to respect. If this resonates, subscribe to The Waking Shadow, where you can explore Carl Jung's psychology and the difficult, necessary movement toward individuation. Watch the video on your screen now to understand what happens when your old identity can no longer contain the person you are becoming.